so text animators. I'm just going to create a string of text here. Right. Now, we've been looking at the default properties, and the default properties are your anchor points and positions, etc. Now, when you create text, you'll see above your transform section there that you also have a text section. Now, the text section gives you a few top level properties, if you want to call them that. The first one is called source text. Now, source text is very simple in that when you keyframe the source text, you're allowed to change the word further down the timeline, and it will store that new text in each of your source text keyframes. So in this case, what the keyframes are storing is the actual text itself. So you'll see that it can change, and you can have as many of these keyframes as you want. You'll see that they're square keyframes, which means that they're hold keyframes. So it's not going to morph from one piece of text to the next. It's actually just going to hold that piece of text until it gets to the next keyframe. So that's your source text. I'll get rid of those, and we'll keep the original text value there. Now, the next one is your path options. Now, path options refer to a mask that you can create that is different to the masks that you've been using to isolate or map transparency and opacity onto layers. This time, if, for example, you create a path that isn't closed, this one is just a curved open path. And now when I change my path options from none to mask 1, you'll see that what it does is it actually maps the text onto that as a baseline. I'll push that up there so it goes back to where it should be. So now the text is sitting on a curved baseline as opposed to a straight baseline. And the baseline is just a typographic term for where the bottom of your text lines up. Now I'm going to set that back to none, and I'll just delete that path altogether because I don't need it. Whoops. Just the mask. Okay, so those are the source text and the path options. And the real action happens when you create an animator. So an animator is a way that After Effects uses to animate text per character. Now, to create an animator, you need to first of all specify a property that you want to animate, and as soon as you've specified that property, it automatically adds an animator, and it'll just give you animator 1 through however many you decide to create, unless you rename them. So I'm going to call this one scale Y, just so that I know what it is basically. Now, animators work by animating a property but constraining that change in property to within a certain range. And those ranges, first of all, are created through what are called range selectors. Now, a selector is the term that After Effects is using for which part of your text is selected for that change to happen. And the way that this is going to work is that you're going to have your default, or your property that the text is set to, your original size in this case. You're going to have a size that it's going to animate to, and in this case I'm just going to animate it, or to change the vertical scale. This is going to be the property that it's going to be changed to within a certain range. And whatever text is selected within the range selector is going to have that change applied to it. Now, the range selector you can see here as this two vertical lines with inward pointing arrows. Now, at the moment, by default, the range selector covers all of our text. So all of the text is in range. Now I'm going to just open up my range selectors properties, and first of all I'll see that I have a start, an end and an offset. Now this is by default set to percentages of the width of the text that I'm animating. My start is this line here, my end is this line here. The start is set to 0% or 0% across, which is the very first point here, the start. The end is at 100% or 100% of the way across the text. Now if I bring those in, you'll see how the range selector is working. So I'll bring the range selector into 25% or 1/4 of the way across my text, and I'll bring the end back to 75%, 3/4 of the way across. Now you'll see that the range has been made smaller, so the range selector is selecting only the text in the center part of the sentence. Okay? Now the offset is where that range is sitting within the text. So if I change the offset to a lower number, it's going to move the offset all the way across until it's actually gone off the left. If I move the offset to the right, you'll see that it moves my range or offsets it positively. And when it's gone to 100, it's gone all the way off across the right hand side. So these are the things that you'll be adjusting and animating. So if, for example, I keyframe my offset, I started at -100% and go out a few seconds, put another keyframe and change that to 100%. You now have a very quick per character animation. Now just to show you how it can be per character, I can actually close that in even more. And you can see it just being applied to that one piece of text. Now, kill that for the moment. And I'll bring that back to 25 and 75. Right, so that's the first concept that you need to get your head around, is the fact that you're using an animator, and the animator contains one or more selectors. Now I'm going to stick with one selector for the moment, and then I'll move it on to using multiple selectors. Now while we're still talking about these selectors, or the range selector in this case, I'm going to go into the advanced section here. Now the advanced section will allow you to base your start, end and offset values on a percentage value or an index value. And an index value simply means that instead of saying I'm 25% across my block of text, it will tell me how many characters, including spaces, I'm gone across before my range selector starts. So you can go by the letter or you can go by the percentage. So I'm going to leave it at percentage for the moment. You can base it on characters excluding spaces, words or lines. So I can set that to words, and it will only clamp that to any words that are within that range selector. So now when I move the offset across, you'll see that it actually animates word by word instead of character by character. Set that back to characters. Now mode is a bit like our masks that we were using before. If you set it to add, then it's going to apply that within that range. If you set it to subtract, then it's going to do the reverse. It's going to kind of make everything inside the range the original value and everything outside the range the new value. Amount allows you to specify, I'll just set that back to add, how much of a change is being applied from your original value to your new value. So if I've that set to 50%, then even though I scaled up my text quite a good bit, if I change the amount back down to 50, then it will kind of mitigate the change that I've made. And I can play around with these, I can keyframe these, and I can use them all in conjunction with each other. Now the next one is interesting from a visual point of view, in that you can actually define the shape that the text takes when it changes from one property to another within that range. At the moment it's set to square. If I set that to triangle, you'll see that it actually scales up in a triangular fashion as it approaches the center of the range selector, and then downwards again. You have got triangle, you've got round, and you've got smooth, and within those you can change the severity of how steep that is as it gets up to that new value by using the ease high, and then the ease low. You can do similar effects where you can actually dictate what that curve looks like as you're moving in and out of that range selector. Now the other two within shape are called ramp up and ramp down. Now these are quite different in that instead of changing to a value within the range and then changing back to that value as you go out of that range again to the right hand side here, what ramping does is it actually uses it as a visual transition. So if I go to ramp up, for example, it uses the range only as the part as the text goes from small to large. And if I bring that across from right to left, you can make your text go to full size and stay at full size, or you can get it fall down like that. And ramping up and ramping down will simply either ramp up to the value or ramp down from the value. Okay, so the ramping and the shape and the shapes that you create are going to say how the text is affected when it gets inside in that range. Now I'm going to leave this at square for the moment, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to push that offset over there, and I'm going to decrease the end value so that no, my start is at 75. I need to bring that down to 25 and change that to about 50 and bring my offset back up to 0. And okay, I'll just pull that down. So I'll pull it further to the left by changing the start and the end. Now you can have more than one selector. The way that you apply a second selector is you go to the actual property changing animator, in this case scale Y, and you can add either a property or a selector. Now if I change, or if I get a new selector and I want a new range selector, I can then go into that selector properties and have a second selector working on a separate portion of my text. And I can animate these independently of each other. I can have them cross over. I can do all kinds of things to them. Now this is having two selectors. Now let's say I wanted to say, right, well I want it to scale up, but I also want it to become semi-transparent as it does. So still using these two selectors, I can add a new property that's going to get changed within the selector. So I go property, opacity, bring the opacity down. So now I'm actually changing two properties with a series of selectors. If I delete that second selector, the opacity stays there, but now that's only being applied within that single selector. Okay, so this is range selectors, and range selectors are moved, they're resized, and everything within that range or outside of that range is going to have a particular property change made to it. And that's pretty much the basics of how these animators work. So just to recap, first of all, I'll just delete that and start again. When you have your text on the composition window, to start off your text animation, you click on the animate arrow. To start it off, you choose a property that you want to change. In this case, I'll go for position. I'll bring in the range. So I have a range selector created automatically, but it covers all of my text. It's going from 0 to 100. So I'll bring that back and I'll bring that forward. Nothing's happening because I haven't changed the position. So if I change the position and now do the offset, you'll see that pretty much the same thing as before is happening, except instead of changing the scale, now I've chosen to change the position. Now I can still add a scale there if I want by going to my animator, getting a new property, scale, and upping the scale of that text so that it goes up and gets larger. Change the offset, and I can do multiple changes to it. Now any property that I change is going to be changed only within whatever selectors I have applied to that animator. So if you want to do something that doesn't happen within this range, you need to create a new animator. Okay, I'll leave that one there.